The last thing Michael Carter lost wasn't his job. It wasn't the little brick house where his children had grown up. It wasn't even the confidence that had carried him through nearly 3 decades of hard work. The last thing he lost was the ability to believe his family still needed him. Looking back, it was almost impossible to identify the exact day everything began falling apart. Tragedy rarely arrives like a thunderstorm. Most of the time, it moves quietly, stealing small pieces of a life until one morning a man wakes up and no longer recognizes the person staring back at him in the bathroom mirror. Michael was 48 years old when that morning finally came. The mirror reflected a stranger with tired blue eyes, silver beginning to spread through dark brown hair, and hands so rough they looked carved from old oak instead of flesh. Those hands had built decks, repaired leaking roofs, carried steel beams, fixed broken fences, and held 2 newborn babies with a tenderness nobody at the construction sites would have believed possible. Yet the only thing Michael could see was everything those hands had failed to hold on to. Every weekday started exactly the same. At 4:47 a.m. Before the neighborhood lights flickered on and long before the first school bus rolled through the streets outside Pittsburgh. A familiar sound echoed across the small apartment. It wasn't an alarm clock. It wasn't the coffee maker. It was the slow scrape of worn leather work boots sliding across an old wooden floor. Emma had grown up listening to that sound. As a little girl, she believed those boots belonged to the strongest man in the world. Years later, she would realize they belonged to the loneliest one. Michael never drank his coffee while it was hot. He poured it into a faded stainless steel travel mug, took one quick sip, then spent the next several minutes quietly checking every room before leaving. He looked at Ethan sleeping with one arm hanging off the bed. He paused outside Emma's door, listening to the soft hum of a desk fan that had been running for years because replacing it never seemed important enough. Finally, he stopped in the kitchen where Sarah was already awake, wrapping a turkey sandwich in wax paper. She never asked whether he had slept well. He never asked why she looked more tired every week. Some marriages survive because 2 people continue talking. Others survive because they learn to understand the silence between every word. Sarah slipped the sandwich into his lunchbox, kissed his cheek, and watched him disappear through the apartment door before sunrise. The hallway light flickered once as it always did, and then everything became quiet again. Michael drove 43 minutes across Allegheny County in a pickup truck that should have been replaced years earlier. The heater only worked when it felt like cooperating. The driver's seat leaned slightly to one side, and the odometer had passed 300,000 miles long ago. He kept driving it because replacing a truck that still moved felt irresponsible when college tuition was only 2 years away. Every decision Michael made began with the same question: would this help his family tomorrow? He stopped asking what might help himself a long time ago. The construction company changed job sites almost every week. One Monday it might be a new apartment complex. The next, a school renovation. After that, a warehouse expansion somewhere beyond the city limits. Michael never complained about the work. He liked building things because completed buildings never lied. You either poured the concrete correctly or you didn't. You either secured the steel beams properly or the inspector failed the job. Life outside construction was never that simple. The harder he worked, the less control he seemed to have over everything that mattered. Nobody at work knew Michael had once owned a small brick house with a maple tree in the front yard. Nobody knew he still dreamed about mowing that lawn every Saturday morning. Nobody knew that every time he passed exit 47 on Interstate 376, he caught himself glancing toward the neighborhood where that house still stood, now belonging to another family. Some losses never stop feeling personal. They simply become quieter with time. During lunch breaks, younger workers complained about overtime, slow internet, rising gas prices, or football scores from the weekend. Michael usually sat alone on an overturned bucket with his lunchbox resting across his knees. He always opened it the same way, carefully unfolding the wax paper around the sandwich Sarah had made before dawn. Most afternoons, he stared at it longer than he ate it. On certain days, the sandwich returned home untouched. Sarah noticed. She never mentioned it. She simply made another one the following morning. Love often speaks most clearly through the conversations that never happen. Money had become something the Carter family discussed without using numbers. Instead of saying they couldn't afford new shoes, they talked about waiting until next month. Instead of saying the refrigerator needed replacing, they joked that it was becoming part of the family. Instead of admitting the checking account was almost empty, Sarah found recipes that magically turned inexpensive ingredients into dinners that somehow still felt comforting. Their children noticed more than either parent realized. Ethan had stopped asking for basketball shoes his friends wore. Emma quietly borrowed used textbooks whenever possible. Neither of them understood every financial detail, but both had learned the same lesson children in struggling families often learn far too early. Some dreams become expensive long before they become impossible. Michael carried one object with him every single day that nobody else had ever seen. Folded inside the back pocket of his weathered wallet was an old family photograph taken nearly 10 years earlier. Sarah stood beneath the maple tree wearing a blue summer dress. Ethan sat on Michael's shoulders with both hands stretched toward the sky. Emma laughed so hard that the photographer accidentally captured her with her eyes closed. The picture had faded around the edges from years of being unfolded and refolded. But Michael refused to replace it with a newer one. Whenever another bill arrived or another unexpected expense appeared, he looked at that photograph and reminded himself why quitting had never been an option. He believed a father was supposed to carry burdens without allowing anyone else to feel their weight. He didn't realize that burdens carried long enough eventually become visible anyway. The first sign that something inside Michael was beginning to break arrived on an ordinary Wednesday afternoon. It wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no phone calls, no sudden disasters. He simply forgot where he had left his work gloves. After spending nearly 20 minutes searching the construction site, one of the younger workers quietly pointed toward Michael's own hands. The gloves had been there the entire time. Everyone laughed, including Michael, but the laughter followed him all the way home. That night, while brushing his teeth, he stared into the mirror and tried to remember the last time he had laughed without pretending. The answer never came. Instead, another thought quietly settled into his mind, one that would grow stronger with every passing month until it became impossible to silence. Maybe exhaustion wasn't the real problem. Maybe he simply wasn't enough anymore. That thought refused to leave him. It followed Michael through every mile he drove before sunrise, every nail he hammered into unfinished walls, and every quiet dinner where he smiled just enough to convince his children that everything was under control. The strange thing about self-doubt was that it never arrived shouting. It whispered, day after day. It repeated the same lie until that lie slowly began sounding like the truth. Michael had always believed a father's greatest responsibility was to protect his family from uncertainty. What he failed to understand was that uncertainty had already found its way into their home long before he noticed it. It lived in the careful way Sarah compared prices at the grocery store before placing anything into the shopping cart. It lived in the growing stack of coupons tucked inside the kitchen drawer. It lived in the silence that settled over the apartment whenever another envelope from the bank arrived in the mailbox. No one needed to open those envelopes immediately anymore. They already knew what waited inside. Another reminder. Another deadline. Another payment that somehow had to fit into a budget that had stopped making sense months ago. Michael often told himself he would fix everything as soon as the next paycheck arrived. Then the paycheck came, disappeared almost instantly, and another promise quietly replaced the last one. Somewhere along the way, hope had stopped feeling like confidence and started feeling like a habit. Every Friday afternoon he drove past the same small gas station on the edge of town. For years he had stopped there to buy 2 chocolate bars, one for Ethan and one for Emma. It had become such an ordinary routine that the elderly cashier sometimes placed them on the counter before Michael even reached the register. Then one Friday he walked in, picked up the chocolate bars, looked at the price for several seconds, and gently placed them back on the shelf before buying only gasoline. The cashier didn't say anything. Neither did Michael. Some moments hurt precisely because nobody pointed them out. That evening Ethan asked if the gas station had run out again. Michael smiled and blamed a late delivery truck. Ethan accepted the explanation without another question. But after everyone had gone to bed he quietly opened the kitchen cabinet and counted the cans of soup lined across the top shelf. He wasn't counting food. He was counting how many days he thought his family could make it if things became worse. Children should never know how to do that. Yet somehow he already did. Emma carried a different kind of burden. She had been accepted into an advanced science program at school. one that required weekend laboratory sessions nearly an hour away. The opportunity could strengthen her college applications. But transportation and equipment fees were more than the family could comfortably manage. Michael filled out the registration form anyway, convincing himself another weekend shift would cover the cost. For the next 6 Saturdays he accepted every extra hour the construction company offered. By the time the program ended, his shoulder ached constantly and the pain in his lower back had become impossible to ignore. Emma never realized that every experiment she completed inside the laboratory had been paid for by another sunrise her father spent lifting concrete blocks instead of sleeping. Michael preferred it that way. If sacrifice became visible, it no longer felt like protection. It felt like failure. Autumn arrived earlier than expected that year. Cold air settled across western Pennsylvania. Leaves gathered along sidewalks, and construction work became increasingly unpredictable as rain delayed projects across the county. One Monday morning every crew member was called into a temporary office trailer before work began. The project manager explained that several contracts had been postponed indefinitely. Until new projects were approved, hours would be reduced for nearly everyone. Michael listened quietly while younger workers complained under their breath. Reduced hours meant inconvenience for some of them. For Michael, it meant danger. Driving home that afternoon, he kept both hands tightly wrapped around the steering wheel even though the truck barely required it. Numbers began moving through his mind automatically. Rent, electricity, car insurance, gasoline, Ethan's school expenses, Emma's tuition savings, Sarah's prescription refill. Each figure pushed the next one closer to the edge until none of them seemed possible anymore. He arrived home nearly 2 hours earlier than usual. Sarah immediately knew something had happened because Michael never came home before dark. She didn't ask questions. She simply placed another cup of coffee in front of him while he sat motionless at the kitchen table. Steam rose slowly from the mug between them, but neither of them reached for it. Sometimes the longest conversations happen without a single word being spoken. Late that night, unable to sleep, Michael walked into the living room where moonlight spilled softly through the apartment window. Ethan had accidentally left one of his basketball trophies on a shelf after cleaning his room. It wasn't a championship trophy. It celebrated participation in a local youth league from years earlier. The gold-colored plastic had begun fading, and one corner of the base was chipped. But Michael picked it up as carefully as if it were made of crystal. He remembered every Saturday morning he had spent driving Ethan to practice before work. He remembered buying orange slices for the entire team because another father had forgotten to bring snacks. He remembered believing there would always be enough time to create more memories. Standing there in the quiet apartment, Michael realized he could remember almost every overtime shift he had worked during the past 3 years. Yet he struggled to remember the last complete basketball game he had watched from beginning to end. The realization settled over him with a weight no construction material had ever matched. Somewhere between trying to provide a future for his family and trying to keep that future from falling apart, he had slowly become a visitor inside his own life. Outside, the first cold rain of the season began tapping gently against the window. Michael stood there listening to it for a long time before placing the small trophy back onto the shelf exactly where Ethan had left it. He had no way of knowing that before another month passed, life would ask him to make the hardest decision he had ever faced. One that would convince him he was protecting the people he loved while unknowingly breaking his own heart even further. The decision arrived on an ordinary Monday wrapped inside a plain white envelope. Michael opened it while sitting alone in his truck outside the construction site. The company had officially reduced its workforce, and beginning the following week he would be moved to an on-call position with no guaranteed hours. He folded the letter carefully, placed it back inside the envelope, and stared through the windshield without starting the engine. Around him, men walked toward the job site carrying lunchboxes, tool belts, and coffee cups. Life continued exactly as it had the day before. Yet Michael felt as though the ground beneath him had quietly disappeared. He drove through the city for nearly an hour before turning toward home. Every traffic light seemed longer than usual. Every familiar street looked strangely unfamiliar. By the time he reached the apartment, he had already decided that Sarah would never see the letter. At least not yet. He would find another job first. He would solve the problem before it became another burden for the family. That promise lasted exactly 11 days. During those 11 days, Michael left home every morning wearing the same work boots and carrying the same lunchbox. Pretending he was still employed full-time. Instead of driving to a construction site, he spent each day visiting warehouses, repair shops, shipping companies, hardware stores, and employment agencies. He filled out applications until his handwriting began to shake. He introduced himself to managers young enough to be his own children. He accepted every polite rejection with the same quiet smile before driving to the next address. By late afternoon he parked near a small public park, ate half of the sandwich Sarah had packed, and threw the rest away because he could not bear bringing another untouched lunch home. On the 12th day, Sarah found the envelope while searching for an insurance document inside the truck's glove compartment. She did not confront Michael immediately. Instead, she waited until dinner, watching him laugh softly at one of Ethan's stories as though nothing had changed. She realized then that her husband had not been protecting himself from disappointment. He had been trying to protect everyone else from fear. That night, after Emma and Ethan had gone to bed, Sarah quietly placed the envelope on the kitchen table. Michael looked at it for several seconds before lowering his head. He expected anger. He expected disappointment. Instead, Sarah reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his weathered fingers. It was the first time in years that Michael finally admitted what had been living inside him. He confessed that losing the house had never been the hardest part. Losing steady work had never been the hardest part. The hardest part was waking up every morning believing the people he loved deserved someone stronger. Someone more successful. Someone who never had to count dollars before buying groceries. His voice broke as he admitted something he had hidden even from himself. Somewhere along the way, he had stopped believing he was the hero of his family's story and started believing he was the obstacle standing in the way of their happiness. Sarah listened without interrupting. When he finished, she quietly stood up, disappeared into the hallway, and returned carrying a worn cardboard box Michael had not opened in years. Inside were dozens of ordinary objects. Ethan's first baseball glove, Emma's elementary school science ribbon, vacation postcards, crayon drawings, a faded Father's Day card made from construction paper. Every single item had one thing in common. Michael appeared somewhere in the memory attached to it. Building a treehouse, teaching Ethan to ride a bicycle, helping Emma finish a volcano model at midnight, dancing with Sarah in the kitchen after the children had gone to sleep because they could not afford a night out. Sarah spread those memories across the table one by one until the entire surface disappeared beneath years of ordinary life. Then she quietly asked Michael to look carefully. Not once did any of those memories involve a paycheck, a promotion, or a house. Every treasured moment their children had saved was connected to time, kindness, patience, laughter, and love. Michael stared at the table until tears quietly blurred the edges of every photograph. For years he had measured his worth using numbers while his family had been measuring him using moments. The difference changed everything. The following morning, something unusual happened. Instead of leaving before sunrise, Michael remained seated at the kitchen table until everyone else woke up. He drove Emma to school. He watched Ethan's basketball practice that afternoon. He filled out more job applications later that evening. But for the first time he understood that providing for a family meant more than bringing home a paycheck. Several months later, Michael accepted a maintenance position at a local community college. The salary was smaller, the title sounded less impressive, and the work rarely attracted attention. Yet every evening he arrived home before dinner. Slowly, the apartment began filling with laughter again. Years passed with remarkable ordinariness. Emma graduated from nursing school. Ethan became an engineer. Sarah finally replaced the old desk fan that had hummed outside Emma's bedroom for nearly a decade. Michael's work boots grew even more worn. But he never threw them away. They remained beside the front door. Not as a reminder of struggle, but as proof that perseverance does not always look heroic. Sometimes it simply looks like getting up one more morning when nobody would blame you for staying down. On the evening of Michael's 65th birthday, the Carter family gathered around a small dining table inside a modest home they now rented in a quiet neighborhood. There were no expensive decorations, no luxury cars in the driveway, and no dramatic speeches, just homemade food, familiar laughter, and 4 people grateful to still be sitting together. After everyone had gone to bed, Michael quietly walked toward the front door. He picked up the old work boots. brushed a layer of dust from the cracked leather, and smiled. For the first time in almost 10 years, he no longer saw the boots as symbols of everything life had taken from him. He saw them for what they had always been. They had carried an ordinary man through extraordinary years without ever asking for recognition. Michael Carter spent nearly a decade believing he had failed his family because he could no longer give them the life he had once imagined. He never realized that the life they treasured most had never been built from promotions, houses, or money. It had been built one ordinary morning at a time by a father who kept putting on the same worn boots, walking out the front door before sunrise, and choosing his family over himself again and again. Long after the boots had cracked, long after the bills had been forgotten, and long after the hardest years had quietly faded into memory, that choice remained the greatest gift he would ever leave behind.